left unity against the quote unquote right is a
Right.
handicap for socialist politics. Like even at the revolutionary level, but even at the
reform level.
Yeah, even at that level, because like isn't it odd how AOC, for example, her like bitter enemy, the person she criticizes the most, is like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is the one of the only other congresswomen without any corporate donors. And
Right.
it's like, say what you will about Marjorie Taylor Greene, crackpot, QAnon believer,
Right.
whatever. They have agreements on certain ideas. They do.
Yeah, of course.
And there was that talk recently with Marjorie Taylor Greene where they were saying the Zohan guy, he's a communist. I don't like him, but he understands the real issues. It's about the cost of living. And he also thinks we shouldn't be uncritical of Israel. I don't really care about them as politicians. It's more like who they're appealing to, their constituents.
I mean, I was going to say that like Laura Ingraham, Fox News host, she, around the time that AOC was elected, argued for an alliance of left and right populism. And as recently as this year, Steve Bannon, in an interview that he gave for PBS for their Frontline series, he said that the radical left should also be against the deep state because they would certainly screw them the same way that they screwed Trump.
You remind me of something that I wanted to bring up with regard to accelerationism, those accelerationists, right? Because I was listening to Sam Altman like on a podcast yesterday, founder of ChatGPT, for those who don't know, OpenAI. Sam Altman was basically saying that he thinks it's highly possible that, you know, the advancement of AI and the automation of a lot of human labor could create so much wealth and allow for so much wealth that it's possible that we'll have something like a socialist society.
Sure.
Now, he doesn't actually say socialism, but he says that like our capitalistic system might not make any sense anymore.
That's right.
That we have enough wealth for everybody. So
that's right. That we don't have to accumulate capital in the same way. It's a kind of a UBI socialism.
It's also, I mean, it's rhymes with Falk, the fully automated luxury communism.
Oh, it does. It does. It keeps things at the level of distribution. It doesn't see the problem in the form of production itself. It sees the contradiction only between production and distribution, not within production.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Chris Cutrone, somebody I've had on my show before, a very controversial guest indeed, but one who is always a pleasure to talk to. Some know him as the last Marxist. Others know him as the Antichrist. Some call him a genius. I'll let you decide. But I think Chris Cutrone wrote a very interesting article recently on socialist unity, I won't speak for him, but something I think a lot of people need to hear about. And I would just tell you to read the article. It's very short. But a lot of people don't read nowadays. They listen to podcasts at work. So we'll get some of the ideas here. And we're going to talk all about that. And then later we're going to get into more very difficult questions regarding the left's history, which I think you're very well positioned to do. And probably what I've got the most value from in your work and talks is the history of the left. I still remember when I first heard you on Sublation in 2019, right when I think before COVID was about to start.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I remember it was just like big eye opener for me. Let's just say that. Anyhow, I guess you don't need an introduction since you've been on the show before. But first off, Chris, what were you trying to do with this article in Socialist Unity? What were you trying to say?
Okay, so I was solicited to write this article by the editors of Sublation magazine. And so I had my basic thesis several months ago, but I only got around to writing it now. And I also took it as an opportunity to kind of republish something I had written for my campaign for a socialist party back in early 2016. And that's a project I actually started in 2015. So that project started before Bernie, before Trump. So what I was trying to do here is, basically look back on the question of on what basis should people collaborate on the left. And I define the left as the socialist left. So I was sort of thinking about how the millennial left went through different phases of thinking about how it wanted to constitute itself, on what basis people were going to agree. So there was left unity. There were even projects called left unity. And then finally, when the millennial left largely resolved itself into the DSA around the Bernie campaign, then within the DSA, there were these caucuses or factions, namely class unity and Marxist unity. Marxist unity is associated with Cosmonaut magazine. Class unity has since left the DSA. So, and I know the people involved in both of those for many years.
Me too. Donald Parkinson of Marxist
Donald,
Unity Group.
Donald for sure, but also other people in Marxist Unity Group who are based in Chicago. There's Moira and Luke and a couple of other people, and then I know people in Class Unity going back many years now. So, but basically it hasn't amounted to what they purported to. And moreover, early on in the millennial left, there was this idea of restarting a socialist party. And this is where Mike McNair of the CPGB, of the Communist Party of Great Britain, had a great deal of influence, as well as Lars Lee's work on Lenin, on Kautskyism, and the kind of Kautskyan or the Erfurt program basis for Marxism of Lenin and others in the Second International, and sort of reconsidering that, which I thought was a fruitful moment. But that's a moment that both predates and postdates Occupy Wall Street, but really predates the turn to DSA around the Bernie campaign. So it's foundational for Jacobin magazine. Left unity understood as a certain kind of Marxist and socialist unity, trying to reestablish a socialist party, but really, to my mind, abandoned by the Bernie campaign, that turn. So I wanted to kind of get back to brass tacks and define what I thought had been implied but never articulated, namely socialist unity. Right. So I think Mike McNair thinks of it as like Communist Party. What's the basis of Communist Party unity? And that language hasn't been used in the broader British and American left, but it's sort of implied. So instead we had left unity, we had class unity, and we had Marxist unity. But really, they were all circling around this question. And I do think that I have something to offer in that regard. Also something that I feel like has been clarified for me as a teacher who accompanied the millennial left generation through their journey. I, kind of worked through the neo-Kautskyism. I saw the potential problems and limitations of it. But then that was really short-circuited and abandoned by the Bernie campaign. And then the squad, 2015, 2016, 2018, second Bernie campaign and expansion of the squad in 2020. Now, my own campaign for a socialist party, when I first conceived of it in 2015, I assumed that Hillary Clinton would be the nominee and would simply be elected after Obama, because I thought the Republicans were in disarray. So I thought that this would open a space on the left, if you will, because whatever hopes people had in Obama, and people tend to forget that they had great hopes in Obama, also with regard to socialism, that this was over by 2015 and maybe now could be thought about differently. There were other contemporary phenomena in this direction. So there was Marxist center idea. There was also Philly socialists. There were various attempts at base building. But the question was, a base for what? So initially it's a base for a socialist party, but then it became the question of base building more for the Democratic Party. And it also had to do with the turn after Occupy. After Occupy Wall Street, there was a kind of liquidation of Occupy activists into like local community activism. Right. So I thought there are these kind of halting impulses in this direction. And really, what should it be about as the basis for an eventual refounding of a socialist party? So it's not immediately supposed to be a party building project, and certainly not an electoral project. Certainly not an electoral project. That's something that I didn't feel the need to clarify very strongly in 2015, 2016, but then afterwards it's become clear that it shouldn't be understood as electoralism or an electoral party. I think that gets to what we'll probably talk about, considering your background as well. What do people mean by politics? Right? What is a political party? What is politics? And, the Marxist view on politics is different from the conventional kind of liberal democratic view of politics, especially in a place like the United States, where politics means running for elected office. It means electoral party organizing. And I'm looking at it very differently, sort of fundamentally differently. So even the campaign for a socialist party is potentially misleading because it has that word party in there. I will also say that this is something completely parallel to Platypus, which was an educational project about kind of theoretical, intellectual, ideological concerns. That this is, we could say, the practice separated from the theory. And, I think that theory and practice are really separated now on the left and with respect to Marxism.
Oh,
So
I agree.
it's pre-political. Go ahead.
When people say that the theory has to involve practice, and that practice has to involve theory, sometimes like they end up watering both of them down, where they reduce anything that is divorced from action now to being irrelevant. So you get this kind of really, really stupefied version of theory. But I guess to clarify for your listeners, Platypus Affiliated Society was, correct me if I'm wrong, kind of a project aimed at, like, for lack of a better term, de-stupefying the left.
Yeah.
Like reaching out to left students with the realism that like the left is coming out primarily through students in these educated circles.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also where the problems of the left are being regenerated and reproduced.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you deal with that? It was kind of like dealing with the history and the problems, but it's not like a party or
Right.
aimed at like organizing the workers, quote unquote.
Right.
And that might be a source of critique, but like you never claimed Platypus was anything
to be doing
but
that.
education, right?
That's right.
And this is different though. This is like an attempt at strategy, like from what I've seen. Yeah,
that's right. And so there are a couple of different elements there. Let me say that I think that the left, as it existed circa 2006 when Platypus started, was mostly an intellectual phenomenon, meaning there was the academic left and there was the activist left. And by these, I mean Marxists. So academic Marxists and activist Marxists, but also other kind of socialists like anarchists, rad libs who might be familiar with Marxism and sort of socialistic. But generally, that was my kind of definition of the left. So propaganda groups, right? The sectarian left, the Marxist organizations. What are they doing? They're doing propaganda. and they're doing a kind of proselytizing. They're trying to keep their theoretical version of Marxism alive through recruiting students via activism. So it's kind of like, if you really want to be an effective anti-war activist, you should be a Marxist, right? Or if you really want to stop police brutality, you should be a Marxist. Or if you really want gender equality and sexual freedom for women, you should be a Marxist. So there was a very, entrenched kind of practice, we could say, on the left that I was familiar with from the 80s and 90s when I got started. Kind of post-New Left, kind of activist left, but also academic left, a symbiotic relationship between the two. And I saw it as not really political, meaning not practically political, but only sort of pseudo-political in the sense that it drew intellectual lines, it drew theoretical lines, drew ideological lines on the left. And it had a lot to do with the deadness of the left, the fact that it had no vitality even at an intellectual level, because the various leftist organizations would pretend that the others don't exist. They would sort of cooperate tacitly in activist milieus, but they would sort of steer clear of each other. They wouldn't debate or polemicize. They wouldn't really acknowledge each other's existence. The group that I had been associated with, by contrast, was all about polemicizing and criticizing these leftist organizations. It was the Spartacist League.
Yeah.
So I was clear about the limitations of what the Spartacists were doing, but also what the other leftist groups were doing. Like, meaning it was basically a kind of matter of polemic and debate, even if one-sided, conducted on ideological levels and conducted on spurious practical or programmatic levels, meaning the positions on things. Positions that people have on X, Y, and Z are just really opinions, meaning they're intellectual positions, they're theoretical positions. They're not practical positions because the left has no practical power, and therefore it doesn't really matter. And even where it does have practical power out in the world, generally it follows a pattern of staking a position that is not actually the position that they hold, is just a kind of messaging or propaganda point with regard to the more dominant capitalist politics. Like Communist Party of India or, Communist Party of the Philippines. Like, what are their positions amount to? They amount to positions vis-a-vis capitalist politics. So I basically saw the role of the left as educational, but still serving a pernicious role in some mediated way, preventing practice, but not directly. I didn't see the left as like really practical obstacle. I mean, there's a lot to this. Protest demonstration as a mode that we get from the 60s that really got institutionalized, routinized in the 80s. The protest demo as a form of politics, which of course has no practical impact. It's just like a media spectacle or something. But really, what is it? It's you give people a sense that they're doing something. You sell newspapers at the protest demo. You recruit a few wayward, students, who are naive and don't realize what they're getting sucked into. And these leftist groups would just cycle through the students like it was a revolving door of recruitment. And so they're very cynical about it too. Like, they understand that they'll recruit 10 people and keep one, maybe. Right. And that will just be enough to reproduce their cadre. It will reproduce their dues based for their organizations so that they can pay their full-time staff. And that's all that really matters. What really matters is that the full-time staff and continue the ideological tendency. And all these tendencies have their roots in like ancient history now, like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s at the latest. Right. So they're completely out of sync. Now, Platypus handles all of that very differently. but I'm just explaining how I understood the left anyway. So it's not like, oh, ideology is really what matters. Well, no, it's a more mediated relationship, and people are attracted to the ideas. But the ideas are botched, miseducation happens, and then the ideas have this funny effect, which is that they are kind of intellectual, like strange, like subcultural intellectual rationalizations for positions that people think within capitalist politics.
Oh yes. That could bring us in a whole different direction, but
Right. This
yeah.
is just to sort of lay the groundwork. So what's the missing piece? The missing piece is actual practice in the way that I would understand it as a Marxist, meaning the practice of, working class, what used to be called social action. So it goes back to the 19th century. It goes back to Marx's own time. And he didn't invent this language. This is the language of the 19th century, social and political action. And it's a big debate among socialists. Should they confine themselves?
A social question, right?
So social question, right? But the First International, the anarchists versus the Marxists. And there's a 3-part division, we could say. There are the statists who advocate political action. There are the anarchists who advocate social action. And then there's Marx, who, it's not that he tries to split the difference exactly, but he tries to combine them, understanding that there might be a contradiction between social and political action in capitalism. But the idea is that you have to sort of embrace that contradiction. You can't just be one-sided within that contradiction. So you have to sort of work through it. So what happens is that the state socialists call the Marxists anarchists, and the anarchists call the Marxists statists as a result of this. But Marxism is both and neither, because it thinks that the proletariat in its struggle for socialism has to be both and neither.
Well, Marxism didn't yet exist, right, in the First International.
No, it's the party of two. It's Marx and Engels, right?
Scientific socialism.
Scientific socialism.
Before the
right, the science.
Because I recently did a video on Marxism in which I would be curious to hear your thoughts on it is made for kind of a lay audience, so. But I wanted to cover the political aspects of Marxism rather than what most introductions do especially on YouTube, which is just the labor theory of value and just very economical. Whereas for me, the politics is more interesting, given my background, right?
Yep.
And I mean, that's one thing that I point out, which seems surprising to a lot of people, which is Marxism doesn't really become a thing till Kautsky,
Yeah, exactly. Almost right, after Marx. Engels is a kind of a bridge figure. Right? And that's why he's often blamed. The people who want to separate Marx from Marxism, they blame Engels.
Right.
He's the vulgarizer, he's the whatever, the popularizer, but he's the degrader of Marx's ideas. But we have enough evidence of Marx's own political thinking. My friend Spencer Leonard published 2 books, which will soon be 3 books, Marx and Engels' political writings. One on Bonapartism, the other on imperialism. The third's going to be on the Crimean War, which is a total trip because these are the writings that people have a very difficult time assimilating to their understanding of Marx. Right? They're seen as journalistic writings. They're seen as, where Marx and Engels are German nationalists or Russophobic, or, there all sorts of things are thrown at them. All sorts of accusations about them as political figures. So it's usually uncomfortable for people to consider, and they really avoid the fact that there's a coherent viewpoint on politics. And
or
on the
they
struggle
do
for
think there's a coherent aspect to Marx and Engels, and they get that very wrong. I think the way a lot of the young people who get, as you I'm sure have noticed, a lot of the young people who get into Marxism tend to be they read Lenin first.
Oh, right.
Or they'll even read someone, a Stalinist teaching Lenin, even a lot worse.
Right.
And they'll think that what happened was that there was Marxism with Marx and Engels. And then what happened is that there was the debate between Kautsky and Lenin, where Lenin was the true interpreter of Marxism and not Kautsky. But they'll leave out Bernstein and all of that. And Kautsky just kind of gets sort of thrown out just because Lenin says the one bad thing about him.
He's a whipping boy.
Yeah, he's in the Renegade Kotsky and in State and Revolution. They don't read What Is to Be Done.
No.
Never read
Well,
What
they
Is to
don't
Be
read
Done.
it that way, right? Meaning they read it just as a how-to guide. They kind of ignore the theoretical claims and what is to be done. You know, I mean, Lenin's a funny one. I mean, I am Lenin. You know, I'm Spartacus. I am Lenin. I am Socrates. I am Lenin. So you know, I definitely, you know, uphold Lenin, but it's an unfamiliar Lenin, and it is the crazy Marxist Lenin, meaning the Lenin who like memorized,
Leninism.
right?
Yeah, you uphold Lenin and I guess way like Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin were ultimately on the same side despite having criticisms
Of
And
each
there's
other.
Marxism, Leninism as like a state ideology.
It's a state
But
ideology.
That's still why I kind of I reject Lenin not in terms of like Lenin as a figure and what he did,
Leninism.
but in terms of Leninism.
Leninism.
Mostly.
It's fraught.
I reject Leninism.
Leninism, and we got two varieties at least. We've got the Stalinist version. We've got the Trotskyist version of Leninism, which ends up being far more Stalinist than Trotsky himself was.
In
fact, right? So there is a problem of Leninism. There's a problem of like the reification, the kind of ideologization of something. You know, you can turn Marx into ideology. You can turn Lenin into an ideology. You can turn anything into an ideology. Theism.
This might be the one thing. This might be one of the things where we disagree, but we don't have to get into it because I think we already did in a previous talk. But like, I kind of think Lenin did sow the seeds. Like, I agree with like Neil Harding, his Leninism book, but I still like,
Marx sowed the seeds too.
I view Lenin like I view Mao, very significant figures that are very important. Lenin even more so. Hence why I make content about them. I wouldn't study them. I don't do the same of Hitler.
No, right. Like, you know, there's no point in saving Hitler against Hitlerism. But there might be a point in saving Mao against Maoism and Lenin against Leninism and Marx against Marxism. Certainly, I've spent a lot of my career as like trying to save Adorno from Adornoism because that's its own problem. There is kind of Adornoism. There are the Adornoites who run around. And, you know, Stalin, it's a little different because Stalin is a more kind of murky figure. Meaning, you know, what did he do? And also, what did he write? What did he think? There's a lot more to go on with Mao than there is with Stalin in that respect. So, but in any case, you know, generally, it's reading history against the grain, reading history in a critical way, where the kind of original historical moment might be a good standpoint to critique for what seems to follow from it. You know, that there's a kind of degradation or a kind of hypostasization, right? So, but this is all, you know, that's my esoterica. So that's Platypus. Platypus is like Marxist esoterica. This campaign for a socialist party is the exact opposite of that. We might say that it's the esoterica of civil social life, you know, of social reality. Trying to grasp that in practice in a way that isn't necessarily representable, at least not straightforwardly in theory. So I've read a lot of history, and I've also dealt with a lot of older people who lived through a lot of the history of the left. And I do think that, you know, like you can read Lenin, but if you don't actually have a sense of the actual history of the movement he was part of, you're going to lose a lot because you're going to miss everything that Lenin takes for granted. So I think that that's the missing piece. That's the missing piece. And I think that we take a lot for granted about social and political reality that we should not. So this is more the campaign and the call for socialist unity. So I can say the campaign for a socialist party, we had a certain kind of history, basically 2015 to about 2018, 2019. So we experienced a crisis around the Bernie campaign and the squad election in particular. And then COVID really set us back in terms of our ability to do what we were trying to do. And so a few years later, where, we've been trying to pick the pieces back up and restart things, bring it back out of hibernation. And it's really been about experimenting, learning what it might take to be an organizer, training ourselves. So that's, it's very different, right? And that has also meant bracketing Marxism. So my general kind of conception of the project is based on certain theoretical assumptions I have as a Marxist, but also even bracketing that, because it's unclear, right? So what would a proletarian socialist movement, what would a working class-based socialist movement, what are its actual possibilities? That's very unclear. And I think that ideology blinds us to that. It blinds us to the possibilities, and it blinds us to the potential problems and obstacles. But really, it blinds us to the possibilities. So that's, it's in that sense, in a way that usually annoys me when leftists talk about being non-ideological. That usually annoys me. But there's an authentic point to that I would want to lose, right? Which is that ideology is a blinker, and also it's a false basis for either unity or difference. So people falling out on ideological lines is probably a false difference. It's a kind of pseudo-political difference. It's a real political difference. So exploring that, I think, is another, if we were to say the missing piece is like the working class as a constant force in society, we could say much prior to that, we could say the missing piece is what would be the actual basis for collaboration and unity in building that up.
To jump straight to what I think is the most interesting point you make is that rather than trying to have socialist unity mean unity of Marxists, which is
Right.
what you were kind of focusing on before, and I know people who are still involved in that, or even unity of leftists, which sometimes just means like leftist, however we define. I mean, I used to like earlier on be pro left unity, increasingly less, in the sense that I actually think it's the idea of the leftist as such, as an entity, as opposed to a relational term
Oh yeah.
of distinction, is actually an ideological obfuscation more than anything. And it's totally antithetical in many ways to the socialist project and the Marxist project. Part of what it kind of gravitated me to Marxism, despite not, like, I wouldn't say, you already know, like, I'm not a doctrinaire Marxist.
No, right.
And I never claimed to be. But
Right.
I've always been not always, but I've been a sympathizer for quite a while.
Right.
And part of why is because they had a material basis for how this is going to happen. Like,
Right.
which is the people with the most power and the most interest to do so. The working class having the most interest, unlike the bourgeoisie, but also having power, unlike peasants.
Right.
Or unlike some random category.
Students.
Like the left today is like the vulnerable, students. It just has like these very amorphous categories that don't make sense as agents for transformation. The people, yeah. Well, that's the right.
Right.
I mean, thing about that is at least it's so vague that at least like you can get people on board. It doesn't usually last because it's defined with usually just means managerial class.
Oh yeah.
The people, right?
Yeah, that's
But
an abstraction.
You argued said like it's the unity of working class that ultimately matters by socialist unity, not like the unity of a bunch of leftists. Because it's like
no,
you get a bunch of leftists, so what? Man, you still probably be like very minority of the population, maybe not even 20%.
Oh yeah,
of like the United States.
Oh yeah, even broadly defined. Like everyone who likes Bernie would be like 20% at most. And it would be progressive. I mean, I had a debate with Benedict Triptofash back in the day. who
We're
was
gonna
like,
get into that
yeah, post-left
later.
or anti-left Marxist, like really an anti-left Marxist, because it was Marxism should be against the left because the left is progressive capitalism. And okay, it's kind of like, yeah, that's true in the conventional sense, but I also think that wasn't what it meant in the 19th century. Like, it's a funny term. The left is a funny term, like a 20th century term. And it does take its meaning from the split in Marxism in the early 20th century. And then it gets kind of transposed onto progressive liberal capitalism, progressivism. In a way, the socialists really distinguished themselves and were quite counter to the progressives in the late 19th and early 20th century. But that's
Ain't that
forgotten.
funny?
Yes. It's funny, right?
Really not the case anymore.
Not the case anymore. And
The
so
left says us as progressives.
that's right, as
Use it
progressives.
interchangeably.
Used interchangeably. And so I do think that that's a problem. And, you know, it is indeed the path back to capitalist politics. This is where Benedict Cryptofash was right. However, you know, I was still upholding the idea that there was a left and a right within Marxism. You know, but it was an ideological distinction and a spectrum rather than entities, right? So what you mentioned, so it's not like an entity, right? Certainly not within Marxism. It's not a sociological category, but an ideological category. And with all the problems of that, meaning, is the struggle for socialism fundamentally an ideological one? No. However, does it necessarily entail ideology? Yes. Right. And then the question is, well, what's the relationship? Well, what's the attitude towards ideology one should have? And I'm an old-fashioned Marxist, meaning we should critique ideology at all times. You know, we should be aware of the pitfalls of ideology. So in that respect, you know, because I think Cryptofash like emphasized against me because I was like a leftist who came closest to this anti-left Marxist perspective. And I felt like, well, I don't kind of agree to the terms, you know? And then we ceased the debate when he said or she said that we were talking past each other, which often happens. So one of the things that I did with this piece is that I tried to avoid buzzwords that could be the basis for people speaking past each other. I tried to be very spare with my terminology. So I avoided some language people would react to, you know, like civil society or, you know, any kind of conventional terms that are bandied about on the left or among Marxists, however one alternately. So I think that this is an issue, but you were going in this direction anyway. What did you have to say about this?
Well, so that what I thought it was probably the most controversial part of your argument, but also one that I think is the one I think is the most important. Is that okay? So if you believe in like working class unity, sometimes I hear leftists say that they'll say what matters is class unity, not the culture war. But what does that actually mean?
Right.
If one is serious of like uniting, quote unquote, the working class or getting as much people who are, you know, full-time workers on their side, that means like accepting that you're going to have people on your side who have big ideological disagreements on social issues, conservative views. And this is something I've been kind of emphasizing for a while. And, you know, when I first got into left, because I always kind of liked aspects of the old left. A long time ago, some people who followed me might remember I had this video called Why Billionaires Prefer Democrats back in the day. I like there's parts of it that I find a little embarrassing just in terms of the kind of simplistic application of Marxist theory, like the base and superstructure and yada yada. But there's at the end I kind of said what matters is not like political unity of the left against the right. It's the class unity.
Yeah.
And I got like comments. There was a few comments that said, well, that if unity of a working class means having a bunch of transphobes on our side, I don't want them. And like you get like comments like this, which is, oh, so It's like, well, this is reality. There's people with conservative views. So if one is serious about changing anything, that means you're going to have like left socially conservative factions of, workers movement and socially
Right.
progressive factions of it. That's just.
So
But
here's
yeah, I'd like you to elaborate on that because.
here's a point maybe that we should make. I don't know whether you would agree with this definition or not, but I have a definition of politics. Politics is organizing people to assert power over the course of human events, right? The direction of society. And so the question is, what do we mean by that? When we say we want to make change, how do we make change? Like, what changes do we want to make and how? Right? So I distinguish politics from policy. So policy is what is done. Politics is who is doing it. And I think that, if people just want more progressive liberal policies on trans issues, then it's wholly adequate to engage in the culture war tactics. That strategy will work. You wear people down, you put a trans character in every TV show and every movie. You push trans like music artists, and then people kind of like trans people, and then they're more amenable to vote for candidates who support the trans rights. And you get some rich people to fund those candidates and to fund cultural production propagandizes that. That doesn't involve organizing the working class at all. Zero. The only thing that you would need to do is get the working class to vote for the capitalist politician that stands for that. So, that's it. So it really depends on what our purpose is. If our purpose is to make changes in capitalist policy right now, then this is not what I'm proposing. That's something else. And frankly, there are a lot of people who are doing that already. So my point is, what is it that people are not doing already? But that they used to do back in the day. And so, again, we shouldn't just be like the junior varsity version of capitalist politics, the left or the avowed left or like socialists. We shouldn't be the people who are organizing the Zoran Mamdani campaign so that they can get a place organizing the next Pete Buttigieg campaign. Because they know how to reach young people. Because they showed in electing Mamdani mayor that they can reach young people, and they got the special sauce of messaging to elect Pete Buttigieg or whomever. Right? And because that's the path. I mean, we have there's a history to this. Meaning it's obvious, like Marxists, Maoists, like Van Jones was a Maoist, and he became an important campaign advisor for Barack Obama. And that's not a betrayal. That's just a natural course of a career.
And then there's the whole, Trotskyist to neocon, Black Panther to neocon. Not so much neocon,
right.
but Republic. I was saying Black Panther to Republican pipeline.
Absolutely, there's a Black Panther to Republican pipeline.
I've looked at this a lot in the past year, and it increasingly, I used to see it as like, did they just get like brainworms? Increasingly, it's actually just like a kind of, like if one accepts bourgeois politics, what side of the aisle are you on based on your current logic?
Yep.
And that's the thing. There was that split between the more conservative left, who's more about tradition and had more austere values, then the kind of more socially progressive left goes into the Democrats. Bohemian, yeah, they go into the Democrats, become McGovernites before, or if you feel like.
In American politics, it's pretty abject, but there are other examples.
Reaganism, I was about to say Reaganism should be understood like how we understand Trumpism, kind of as a working class, in some way, revolt against the managerial elite. Whether or not that actually whether or not this, regardless of what Reagan actually did, and policy highly capitalistic, but there's this book called Reagan, Working Class Conservative. Very
yeah.
interesting autobiography, or not autobiography, biography of Reagan, and like showing how
Oh
he was
yeah.
like a New Dealer,
Oh yeah.
and then saw that what him changing sides wasn't that he changed principles, but that the other side changed the principles.
Yes,
And it's like a lot of the working, like actually, I think Reagan won the working class vote twice.
he did.
Yeah, by more than Trump did.
More than Trump did. That's right. More than Trump did. But Trump's also a Democrat who's taken the same course. Now, so, what I was going to say is, like, if we look at other countries like Britain and France, like, there were Trotskyists who were in the Mitterrand, the Francois Mitterrand socialist government in the 80s. Obviously, there were various socialists and communists, Trotskyists, Stalinists around, like Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn, and like that's just the nature of things. And you could say, well, Francois Mitterrand's like a Socialist Party and Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party are like completely different from the Democratic Party. No, no, right? So the Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party was a total neoliberal party. It was Tony Blair's party, and Mitterrand was a neoliberal. Like the Mitterrand government did neoliberalism in France. And, so it's, in the American political scene, it seems a lot more sordid. It seems a lot more opportunistic because of the nature of the Democratic and Republican parties. It seems more like an abject betrayal of principle when leftists involve themselves in the parties. Whereas in the European context, it gets much more blurry. Of like, oh, wait, what is the difference between the Labour Party and like a socialist party? What's the difference between the Socialist Party and the communist parties that exist in France and what I'm talking about, which is the missing piece of the working class as a social force, as a social power, and then as a political power, potentially. It's also, we were talking about Kautsky before. Why were people like Eugene Debs just intransigent opponents of the system? So even when they ran for office, even when socialists like that were elected to office, they just voted no on everything. They were just the opponents of capitalist policy. Intransigent opposition. And that wasn't just an ideological position. It wasn't like a pose. It wasn't like an ethical pose. It wasn't like Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul and Ron Paul voting against everything, and giving speeches. It wasn't like that because it actually had a different social base. There was a base for it. There was a cultivated working class intransigent opposition to capitalist politics and also to bourgeois civil society. We can just put it in those terms, right? And there's a lot of precedence for this. I like to point to the fact that socialists organized the civil rights movement in the United States in the 40s and 50s, and also that the NAACP and the ACLU were both started by socialists in the United States. More tricky, Planned Parenthood was also started by a socialist. It's a complex history, and obviously from certain leftist ideological, Marxist leftist ideological perspectives, the old socialist movement of the early 20th century seems way too ideologically diverse and heterodox, right? And yet it still had Marxist leadership. It's still ultimately the leaders, the main organizers were Marxists. And there was a coherent proletarian socialist core to the whole thing, even though it led broader ideological tendencies. And I think that's the point. Can we get back?
Even the most mainstream civil rights activists were at least Marxist sympathizers, like MLK.
Even MLK.
Yeah. I do find it funny. It says a lot about the new left or the left today that usually it's more popular to like the post-civil rights movement than the civil rights movement.
The Black Power turn.
Yeah, exactly. Black Power turn. Like they like to talk about the Black Panthers, but not why they collapsed and what came after. Not like even within like I think you could even like look at like Huey Newton and Bobby Seale as very different figures in different directions.
Mm-hmm.
But the direction that came afterward, this sort of like more racialist turn, is the one the left seems to like more. Whereas like MLK is seen as a kind of lukewarm reformer trying to appease white people, and A. Philip Randolph isn't even discussed usually.
Not even, right. He's
Not even
forgotten.
discussed.
He's forgotten. And Bayard Rustin is remembered, but in a kind of unfortunate way, because he's turned now, Obama like produced, helped fund a film for Netflix on Bayard Rustin, a biopic. My old mentor, Adolf Reed, wrote an article about it. Fun tricks you can play on history, like a critique of the Bayard Rustin movie, because it turns him into an intersectional figure because he was black and gay. And like the socialism is kind of non-existent. And even the sort of black identity and the gay identity is attributed in a way that is not really true to Rustin's comportment. So yeah, I mean, this is again what has been forgotten, what has been really lost, and I do think the new left. I mean, it's something that we'll talk about in the second half. I think that there was an authentic possibility for refounding a socialist party for the new left, but it was abandoned by the late 60s. And it was around things like the Vietnam War and the Black Power turn. The new left got sort of pseudo-radicalized and lost the plot on socialism, lost the plot on the whole point. Like if you want a new left, what you're talking about is a new socialist left. That's the point. What they instead gave us was a new Democratic Party. And, I think that that's where the millennials are going, of course. They've been going there since 2016, basically, since 2015, 2016, but really solidly in 2017, 2018. Now, again, what are we forgetting? Even from like the millennial left had like an intention. I knew these people, Bhaskar Sankara. Like I know what their intention was, and I know what they gave up. And so it's I now am making this proposition to people who are basically the remnants, and in coming in the wake of that, so millennials and Zoomers who don't want to give up on the possibility entirely are left high and dry now, with everything resolving itself into the Democratic Party in the way that it has. Right. So I think that that's really, in some ways the purpose. It's a perennial thing. It's not something that's tied to 2025. The thing with the Trump re-election is whether it's good or bad for this kind of an effort, we have to try to make an opportunity any circumstance, really, because this need is perennial. It has been there. And so again, the question is, on what basis would we collaborate with people? Would we unify? And with what purpose, right? With what basis and with what purpose? So if the purpose is ultimately towards refounding a socialist party, how does that inform us? How does that help us understand what we're doing now in the here and now? Right. So, working class independence, what does that mean? It's not something that we have to begin with. It's something that we have to build towards, but just knowing that that is a purpose. I feel like I wrote this thing in order to remind people that there are these tasks, there are these purposes, that they exist at all, because I think it gets lost.
What you're kind of suggesting here about like the need to kind of be pragmatic in how you actually make something like a socialist party happen by having people on both sides of the aisle who may have disagreements but have mutual class interests. and that can be a basis of mobilization as opposed to something that doesn't really have a material basis and thus will collapse upon contradiction, like, the Rainbow Coalition.
Right.
Because that's what my issue with intersectionality is, that it adds class to the equation, but it doesn't center it. So it ends up being like, these things just occasionally overlap, but it's very easy to pit all these things against each other.
And class
Very
is it's a kind of identity, like other identities. It's like a social group identity. It's
If
not
one
a
treats it that way, yeah. Yeah, the
Yeah, if one
Stalinist
treats
conception of class, yeah.
Absolutely. And so if the purpose is to make the working class exist as such, right? Not just poor people, not just relatively disempowered people. I mean, look, there is an organized working class, there's a labor movement. I don't think of it as really being that. I think of it as a petty bourgeois constituency for capitalist politics. I see it as the interests of some people in the working class, perhaps against others in the working class.
Very Leninist of you, which, to be fair, is his great contribution. Like,
Right.
I very much think Lenin's greatest contribution is bringing back the political component of Marxism, which is that, like, trade unions are good and all, but like, they're not really there's nothing really about them that's inherently political. Like, what is politics? I mean, so my mentor is like a big Baijiu guy, Saad Haider, and they kind of introduced me to these sort of thinkers, and it might overlap a little bit. I know you have your beef with Baijiu probably, but I mean, his understanding of politics, I do like it as an intervention into history. Like, there's history, and there's interventions into it, which you said, changed the course of events. He talks about like an event that changes the logic of the world. It's kind of similar sounding stuff, but like,
right.
It disrupts the flow of how we even think of like politics. Like, it's not
That's
just
right.
like, it sets a new playing field. And I mean, I think events can happen on the right too. That's the thing.
Of course.
We have to be aware that there's right events.
Absolutely.
Perhaps as an event.
Of course. Well, undoubtedly. Right.
Well, like, I mean, yeah, like, it might seem obvious, but
a lot of people are trying to deny it.
A lot of people say he's just another Republican continuing.
Think Vivek Chipper.
Yeah.
Has argued.
I used to believe that too.
Right, he's just a Republican. And well, I think it's hard to think about.
The Democrats act like he's like a fascist. So that's the thing. In response to that,
you could just say he's ordinary.
He's just a Republican. Yeah, but it's like, I don't know. I think it's kind of like Reagan 2.0 in the sense of kind of neoliberal, but also at the same time like a symptom rising to the surface of like, I hate to say it, but like, the people sticking their the people, but like, look, the working class, okay, is part of that, sticking their finger to the liberal establishment. Like, what else? How else can one look at that? I mean, it's like he won the second time around by more working class people,
more working class, more minority.
Yeah, it's like it was almost necessary for history to like
demonstrate.
Yes, I see now finally leftists dealing with some of the problems. Like, before, I remember there was the whole, is there, just because we can't define wokeism and it's a vague, doesn't mean that there's no, like, whatever it's pointing to is an issue. Like, they like to say there's no problem with the left and policing and all that. And
right. Well, there is no cancel culture. There's just accountability.
Oh,
and who could be against accountability? And it's like, come on.
That is into history. I was trying to bridge it back to the party.
So the logic of history. I mean, so I think that I also, in terms of the strategy, like my notion of this part of a larger political strategy, I think that part of the task is creating the necessity of a socialist party. So, we might say in a kind of abstract sense, there's a need for the working class to organize into a socialist party. But that's not really manifest. And so the question is how to act now as to motivate and really manifest that necessity. So, you mentioned what is to be done. So Lenin, that's at the beginning of the movement. That's after the movement's been going for a number of years in Russia and also internationally, and in some ways, more importantly, internationally. And so 1902, he's saying, okay, now might be the time to form a party similar to the SPD in Germany. Have some kind of centralizations, programmatic coherence. And before that, maybe it was premature. Maybe it would have just ended up being an ideological sect. Right? So the moment had come, it was properly motivated. And then the question is, how do we understand the motivation and therefore the actual task of making this into a real party? We're far from that. So we're really at a stage, I would say, like think about the Russian case is very tricky, but let's do it anyway. The Narodniks, like the people who are Narodniks, who ideologically broke with Narodnism, became Marxists, and helped start the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And it took 20 years almost for that to become like a real party. That's where we are, right? So out of the petty bourgeois radical left, out of like petty bourgeois radical democracy, out of all sorts of mixed discontents, how do we begin to glean from the possibility of a working class movement? Because I think that otherwise we're in this left populism, right populism sphere, or we're in what Jacobin calls like the class de-alignment of the Democratic Party, right? Because this is the way to, people have interpreted Trump's working class vote is to say, oh, this is the class de-alignment of the Democrats. And this is right populism versus left populism. And, of course, there's a kernel of truth to all this. However, I don't think the Republican Party, I don't think the Trumpified Republican Party is really going to do a serious effort at creating a working class constituency for itself. In other words,
of course not.
It's not going
look what it's doing now. Like it's repealing Medicaid, like taking people off Medicaid. So like,
even though Trump himself probably didn't want to do that.
Well, he has all these big tech people in his coalition.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, because they've set their priorities. Meaning, again, it's kind of like you can benefit the working class by continuing to provide Medicaid on a fairly liberal basis, or you can benefit the working class by trying to reindustrialize the country. And he prioritizes reindustrializing the country. And so it's of course it's a total mess. And but in any case, at a more fundamental level, the working class vote is probably seen as too mercurial for the parties, meaning they can't count on it, and so they wouldn't want to depend on it, and so they don't really want to activate it. Like, if they can only win by getting the working class vote, that's very dangerous for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, their interests are at odds with all the people who work in the Democratic Party campaigns who usually come out of colleges. And, it's like the college people go to college are often working class, especially in America where you pay all this debt. I still find it crazy. But like, as a Canadian, right? But it's like, for one, it's like college kids, they have the aspirations to become something.
Social climbers. Absolutely.
Yeah, social climbers. And also, like, let's be honest, who has the time to do college work to pay off the debt and do organizing politically? Probably trust fund kids.
Yep.
A lot of the time, or like some degree of that.
Yep.
And what issues do they really care about? Sometimes they'll say like capitalism this, capitalism that, but it's like, but really, like, I was I believe believer in Bernie in 2016. In 2020, I wanted him to get big so that if he got rigged, the nomination got rigged against him, that it could create a real like socialist movement. That was my sort of hope. But when I saw what really made it clear to me, like this left category is a big obstacle and source of obfuscation, is how like the whole thing that people were telling Bernie is that he's not winning enough black voters. He's not winning enough Latino voters. He's not winning enough LGBT people because he lost
Suburban
to
women.
California, right? Suburban women. So then he kind of tried to do that. He tried to pivot to the social issues a little bit, even though he's a bit too old for that. He tried to pivot to that. Yet all the people who were like were voting Buttigieg. Because I'd meet people like this in Canada often, because we pay more attention to American politics than Canadian politics. And like there's this very specific archetype of like the Buttigieg and Warren voter.
Yeah.
Who's like progressive and considers themselves even left-leaning or leftist. But Bernie, too old, too white. And when it was Biden versus Bernie, they all went to Biden.
Yep.
Because of Trump derangement syndrome. Yet Biden's way more socially conservative than Bernie is.
Yeah.
So immediately there, I was like, okay, this is like a problem. And the social the social issues can actually be a way to very much create class division. And
well, certainly. And certainly my old mentor Adolf Reed would say so. Right. That, that these politics are a class politics, meaning they're not an alternative to a class politics. They are a class politics. And they're ruling class politics. Now, I mean, what I'd say about Bernie, Bernie was not trying to show that an old straight white guy can be elected with the right message. What he was trying to show is that his economic message could resonate with the identity politics constituencies in the Democratic Party. All right, so he was trying to affect the program of the Democratic Party. And he was trying to sort of create a mandate, an electoral mandate for progressive policies. He was never going to be the nominee. He knew that.
In 2020, you mean? Because I think I viewed Bernie 2016 as a separate event.
Well, it's a different event, but in either case, would the Democrats have allowed him to be the candidate? Never.
Sure. Yeah. Well, probably not. Yeah. Unless they totally.
Well, it's still coming out how much they rigged 2016.
Right. 2016, way more. I mean, that's the thing. I find 2020 more sad because it seems from what I've seen, like 2020
he capitulated.
Yeah, it was like a fair defeat, whereas 2016 seemed there was all sort of like closing.
But the question is, why did they need to rig it? They didn't really need to rig it to like keep Bernie out. They needed to rig it in order to keep his vote down, so that they wouldn't have to pay much attention to his message programmatically. Yeah, they're trying to weaken him as a message candidate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of
course. They're trying to weaken the message. They were like, yeah, we don't want to be bothered with that.
Hillary. That's like the revolutionary case for electoral politics is like, you're probably not going to be allowed, and this is not the way you really make things happen, but to have the public actually know who you are.
Yes.
Right. To like mobilize people. I mean,
yes,
that you got to have a platform and be heard by people. So that's like the case for it. That's kind of what I was hoping Bernie would do, and had the opposite effect, unfortunately.
I think it's super tricky
with Trump. But it also, like with Bernie, the reason I view it separately is because that was Bernie when he was not a Democrat, and he joined the Democratic Party cynically, and that's why they always said, "You're not a real Democrat," and that's why I like them. And I think that's why.
He was getting too many independent voters, and so there was that he didn't reflect the will of the party because he was winning primaries on the basis of independent voters. They made the same case against Trump. That Trump wasn't really winning the core Republican Party voters in the primaries. He was winning by bringing in these independents or even maybe Democrats. Right? So it was the same argument. And, that's just the party trying to stick to its tried and true electoral strategy, right? That's just the party, it's conservatism in either case, because they don't want to mess with a winning formula, even when it's not a winning formula. You don't want to mess with the Obama coalition. And so all that Bernie was trying to do was restore the Obama coalition from 2008. Because after all, Obama, like Bill Clinton, won back the Reagan Democrats. Right? But then that went down in 2012. And then there was a fear that these people that Obama had won in 2008 would not be there in 2016. And so Bernie's like, this is how we get them back. And so, I mean, it's clear. So for me, I mean, the thing about using electoral politics as a way of organizing people, I think it's very treacherous. And again, I'll cite my mentor, Adolf Reed. Electoral campaigns are not a way to build a movement. They're a way of registering the strength of a movement. So the movement itself has to be organized. Now, Adolf himself went against that in practice in a number of ways, meaning around the Bernie campaign, because of Medicare for All, he really, and then very ambivalently, because he was afraid that enthusiasm for Bernie would result in the Republicans being elected when Hillary was the inevitable candidate. And so he was very concerned that even though he wanted to advocate for the message that Bernie was propounding, he didn't want it to be at the potential expense of people voting for Hillary. Right? And that's because since 1980, Adolf gave up on socialist politics. Very explicitly. He's like, yeah, we'd set to fight the right. Now's not the time for a socialist politics. And then it turns out it's never the time for a socialist politics. Right? Except it's always the time.
And this whole fight the right thing, that's the thing that annoys me the most. It's like this idea of defining the left in opposition to the right. And that's all what matters. And it's such an easy switch to turn on to just get people to stop thinking and stay in line. Like whenever there's an election, you see it in France too. It's like, or various countries too at this point. It's like, oh, at the end of the day, you need to get the right out. So it's just, don't worry about it. Get behind the progressive politician. But then you're like compromised, and the working class sees leftists and liberals as indistinguishable. And
yep.
I used to be also one of the people who would love to, like, whenever someone would say liberals interchangeably with leftists and say, well, they're not the same thing, blah, 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 blah. Increasingly, I view that, like, that mass opinion of liberals and leftists as being indistinguishable. I mean, it's based in a fact.
It's based
in a reality.
Absolutely.
It's based in the truth. And it's like like what made sense in the Popular Front Against Fascism, perhaps, right? It's just like we're still in that mentality.
Except it never worked. The Popular Front failed to stop fascism. Like, we shouldn't forget that. What it did was it maybe one or two or three, China, Vietnam, Korea, right? The Popular Front failed. It wouldn't have succeeded in Eastern Europe, but for the Red Army. It didn't succeed in stopping fascism in France. It didn't, right?
Or in Spain.
Obviously in Spain, there's a civil war, obviously. So it doesn't work. It's, the Popular Front Against War and Fascism has never stopped a war or fascism. It never will. I mean, I guess that's my Trotskyism. But
it made sense only geopolitically, like as in the Soviet Union maybe shouldn't have called everyone else social fascists and say that, oh, they're no better than the fascists. And then they like flip switch when they get invaded in the Blitzkrieg. So like,
well, I mean, that's all aesthetic, meaning that's all opportunism.
Well, I think they believe that. I think they believe this.
They believed it. They believed it.
I actually think there's a truth in that. That like the reason why I have a nuanced view of fascism is like fascism in the sense where I think to really evaluate an ideology, you have to look at how it is before it gets power. And like looking at the French fascism, Italian fascism, Belgian fascism. I mean, even German fascism is a little different, but it's quite different. But Phalangism in Spain. I mean, it's kind of like right wing.
We shouldn't demonize fascism either.
It's like totalitarian social democracy.
That's right.
That conception. It is socialist, but in a not Marxist sense.
No, I mean, look, I'm in the United States.
Control over everything.
But conservative liberals will say fascism is from the left. They will say Hitler was a leftist. And from their perspective, they're correct. Meaning they see it as like totalitarian statism. Like they're right about that. And that comes out of this kind of crazy, anti-liberal, anti-capitalist, anti-bourgeois ideology. So they're, as far as they're concerned, as far as conservative liberalism is concerned, fascism is the left. It's totalitarianism. It's whatever. And, I mean, obviously that's, it is absurd. I always like to say,
it's not so much the point I'm making.
no, you're making a slightly different point. I would say that, being a student of the Frankfurt School, they're seen as like, I don't know, the critics of fascism or something. Fine. It's sort of sentimentalized. More specifically, like, and more esoterically, they didn't want to see fascism as the end of the story. Meaning the triumph of fascism doesn't mean the end of the struggle for socialism. Now, that's a hard one too. But anyway, we're not dealing with that right now. And we'll probably not deal with it. Meaning I'm of the opinion that if there is a kind of hard right ideology, it's going to surprise us. It's not going to look like the older varieties. It's going to come out of left field, so to speak. And it's going to surprise us. And so we don't really have that. And not in the sense of a mass movement. So, but fight the right. I wanted to get back to a point. So politics. I think
ML's today, not to be hyperbolic, but a lot of Marxist Leninists, and I don't call them fascists because the way most people understand the term is so like politicized and it's associated with the far right that like it would be like, of course people would be like, why would you call it? But I mean, like when their substance of socialism is a state basically using corporatism to like bring workers and capitalist interests together under a total state. Like, so China, that's why they point to China as socialist.
The actual
like, that's literally Mussolini. Like, that's also why Roosevelt and Dewey praised that.
Actual Maoists, like not Dongists, not, people who like Xi, like, but actual Maoists, like hardcore Maoists, consider China a fascist state. And there's a kernel of truth to that.
Fascism doesn't mean necessarily the worst thing, worst evil ever. Like,
right. It doesn't have to mean concentration
I think China is actually one of the
war.
Yeah, like I don't view China as a socialist state. I think China is just one of the most competent capitalist states. It's great at building roads. It's been very successful and lets you keep out of poverty, but that's all fair game and bourgeois politics.
Of course. Well, so what I would say about, I think that there's an implicit, like Carl Schmitt view of politics that has kind of taken over. And so I think that when people hear politics, they hear who's the enemy. They want it to be defined by how you're defining the enemy. So is your enemy white supremacy?
Just for the audience, the friend-enemy distinction.
The friend-enemy distinction, that's right.
Schmitt.
And now this is also not a great representation of Schmitt's own thought. So it's like Schmittianism. But anyway, the degree to which he did ontologize politics as based in the capacity for making a friend-enemy distinction, which then can be changed, meaning you can be allies with the former enemy and whatever, right? So it's not like the friend-enemy distinction in the sense of, exterminationism or something. It's just politics understood in those terms.
Yeah, Schmitt did mean the kind of exterminationism, but I mean, that's the theory of the partisan.
Oh, of course. Yeah,
irreconcilable differences. I mean, you go to war.
You go to war, right. That just opens a can of worms about what war is, right? In terms of like thinking about politics or war and, war as a form of politics and all that good stuff. But, so who's your enemy? Is your enemy white supremacy? Is your enemy patriarchy? Is your enemy cis heteronormativity? Cisgenderism? Is your enemy capitalism, meaning your enemy, therefore, are the capitalists, right? Anyone who supports capitalism, like anyone who supports white supremacy or anyone who supports patriarchy, and maybe they support it unconsciously, right? Like, but who's the enemy? What's the enemy? Right? How are we distinguishing ourselves from the enemy? And maybe the enemy is within us, and so we need to like do consciousness raising and self-criticism to like fight against the inner enemy. And I just think, it's not about the enemy. It's not about enemies. It's not about making enemies. And it's not about making friends in terms of friends as opposed to enemies. Like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, like that, right? all of that is not what we're talking about when talking about politics. And so it's not the working class as opposed to the capitalist class. Meaning, let the capitalist class define itself as the enemy of socialism. Because right now, it's not. Right now, the capitalist class is not like the enemy of socialism. It doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to define itself that way. Right? So it will define itself that way, but then it will be a political question, meaning some capitalists are going to support socialism. Some capitalists are going to support a proletarian socialist movement. They always did. You know,
What you're getting at against class identity politics.
For sure.
In that there are class traders, and also there's all kind of weird motivations to why people do what they do.
Yep.
I do very much believe in a lot of elite theory. I think it complements certain gaps in Marxist analysis, and I see it kind of used in tandem with it because it's a form of class analysis, but looking at the divisions at the top.
Oh yeah.
Because mean, like that is like, I mean, who financed Lenin's return to Germany, his exile, right?
Yeah. I mean, the thing about analyzing differences at the top is that they usually are not terribly principled. They're usually contingent. You know, they're transitory. You know, there's a great deal of opportunism there because there's a great deal of existing power. Right. So the other point is like empowering the working class, like creating working class power, socially and politically, even economically. So like the working class just has power, would need to organize itself power, as opposed to state actors or capitalists who just have power. And then the question is how they exercise that power. And I think that, you know, divisions in the ruling class don't necessarily amount to real differences as regards society. Right? They could just be policy opinion differences. And they might kill each other over it. And they might get other people to kill each other over it too. But that doesn't mean that those are like substantial differences from the standpoint of a socialist politics. Right? So just, you know, being aware that everything is capitalist politics, and in that respect, you know, there's no point in taking sides in it. There really, I mean, I do feel like, you know, after 100 years, it has not benefited the proletarian socialist movement to take sides in capitalist politics. That's been demonstrated over and over again. You know, that's been tried. And I think that what happened was, it was like a tactic. It was like there was an organized working class socialist movement, and then tactically, it tried to take advantage of differences within capitalist politics. But when we're in our situation now, when there is no constituted working class politics, then it's very backwards and very invidious to the cause to try to start with the differences in capitalist politics, but really to treat them as extrinsic, alien, you know, as their own thing. You know, it's like, I mean, at a certain level, I would want to encourage people who want to help build a working class socialist movement to treat differences in capitalist politics as warfare. Meaning you have to...
Yeah. I like to use the cartel example.
Racket theory. The racket theory.
Refer to parties as cartels.
Yeah.
I mean, especially in the American case, it's the most blatant. I mean, like
obvious.
Gerrymandering. That's literally what gangs do.
Yep.
Carving
they
up
divide turf.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And they do that with, you know, electoral constituencies as well. Meaning they agree on the terms of their competition in a way that the working class would have nothing to do with. And I think that's very important. You know, the way that capitalist politics agrees on the terms of competition, including up to and including warfare, are wholly extrinsic to and alien from what's required in terms of a working class movement for socialism. Right? Of course, the working class objectively has interests in the divisions within capitalism. does. The working class, as I put it in the article, the working class is divided by capitalist divisions. It is. But then that just tells us the task, which is to organize in such a way as to cut against those divisions within capitalism. And to suspect that divisions that leftists want to introduce are ultimately capitalist divisions. So my basic critique of identity politics, they're divisive. Whether it's racial or gender or sexual politics or other kinds of cultural politics or religious, communitarian, sectarian divisions, that they're divisive, and as such, they serve capitalism. They divide the working class. As such, they serve capitalism, even if those divisions are not immediately manifest in the ruling class, because often they're not.
Sometimes they start there.
Sometimes they start there, but sometimes they end there.
Right. I mean, there's, I'm very Christopher Lasch influenced by Christopher Lasch.
Right.
There's the revolt of the elites.
Yes.
Sometimes, I mean, that kind of opened my eye to this, like a lot of the subversion of norms that the left identified itself with since the 60s.
Oh, it was an elite revolt. Absolutely.
Germinated at the top. And I mean, I see it all the time in the academy. It's like this idea of just subverting itself is what the left is. It's just untangling the status quo by like every mean necessary, where it's like you can lose sight of that. It can be not just not working class politics, but actually antithetical. In the sense that like for a lot of working people, like the family is the only refuge left outside of like work life. However broken that is, right? However imperfect. Like, why else?
The capitalist bohemians would have divisions manifest within the family. Meaning they really are, they would advocate for wives turning against their husbands and children turning against their parents. Right? So, it is, again, how do we, and again, it's like, how do we not put the cart before the horse? Meaning, of course, there are oppressive aspects of working class life, but how will they actually be overcome? Will they be overcome through some kind of like capitalist ideological subversion of norms? No. Like, you can kind of rearrange things a bit, or you can provoke a kind of conservative reaction among the working class too.
Or that's the other. Or we could have a more radical view, which is capitalism already does that.
Capitalism already does that. It does it effectively.
The red left risks, or I wouldn't just risk. I mean, I think the left has become in large part a superstructure for capitalism. Like,
of course,
the new spirit of capitalism, right? It's
of course,
permissive father view, right? Of like,
of course.
I mean, it's good. I mean, there's also just the contradiction.
Yep.
And I really could just the fact that how does one make sense of the fact that the most progressive cities are the most capitalist cities? It's where the most capital is concentrated. Those are the most progressive cities, like New York, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, right? And it's like, why is that? And why is the left, right? That's the bigger problem. Why is the left only able to win in those areas? Like New York, like it's only able to win in these areas. That's concerning. And it's like they'll like to say, oh, but urbanization is proletarianization. It's like, no. We've already like industrialized.
Yeah. This is a post-industrial urbanity. Absolutely.
Right.
And it's, I mean, there's a lot of consumer politics as opposed to producer politics. That's another point, is that the left tends to define itself on consumer issues, not producer issues. Right. And of course, the fact that politics becomes a consumer item doesn't help. It feeds into this. But yeah, I mean, progressive capitalism, that's a hard one. Meaning, I would say that from a socialist perspective, what's progressive in capitalism is not progressive. Now, that doesn't mean that one should oppose it per se, but one should always be wary of it. And, meaning there is a conservative reactionary character to any working class movement, including a working class movement for socialism. But that's a tricky proposition, meaning that doesn't mean, because there's going to be a whole capitalist constituency for holding on to the old form of capitalism against the new form of capitalism. And who's progressive and who's conservative, it's very murky. It's very paradoxical. Again, going all the way back to the old socialist movement as some kind of a model, that it wasn't defined by this conservative progressive split in capitalist politics, even though it's contemporaneous with it. And in many respects, it's both and neither, progressive and conservative. And the parties can shift in their role. So what was once the progressive capitalist party can become the conservative capitalist party. And again, Reaganism. Was Reaganism progressive or was it conservative? Well, obviously it's progressive, updated capitalism. It was conservative only in a cultural sense. And even then, it's unclear. By promoting this neoliberal form of capitalism, didn't Reaganism actually create the new identity culture that we have? Right? And so, so I think that, again, stepping to one side of all of that is very crucially important. Rather than trying to parse, well, we want to out-progressive the capitalists. Right? Whereas, I know this from academia. So academia is a little bit of a test market for progressive capitalism. It's where a lot of things get tried out, both at a practical and ideological level. And then it seeps its way into corporate culture as useful. Right? Since it is, training capitalist management. Right?
Indeed.
So it's a test market for all this stuff. And so, I'm sure that there's a whole upper and middle management layer who have all read Adorno in college. I'm sure it's very much informing their practices.
Founder of BuzzFeed was a Deleuzian.
Right. Now, of course, I'm going to say that postmodernism lends itself more to that. But I'm saying even my boy Adorno can be tailored to fit,
of course,
the needs of.
The what's his most popular book they like to cite the most usually? It's his worst one in my view, the Authoritarian Personality. Which I still think it's his worst work ever.
It certainly has its downsides, and it certainly is misread, meaning the point of it is misread. And, but, he has to be forgiven. He had to earn a living and he had to work with these sociologists because it's a co-written book. It's a project. It's a group project. And maybe its intervention was misguided. Certainly the terms lend themselves to a kind of Bowdlerization and, kind of, I don't know what, dividing the population into authoritarian and non-authoritarian types, which just becomes a self-flattering ideology of the progressives, that they're the good, liberal, independent, think for themselves kind of people. Right? And that's
certainly not the case anymore.
It certainly is not
never
the
was.
case anymore. Right. It kind of never was. So I think that, again, right now we're dealing with the fact that we should really be questioning. And I think that it gives rise to this kind of beyond left and right stuff that one encounters in the current moment. Is that,
which I'll be honest, I'm sympathetic to in some regard.
Sure. But it can lead all sorts of places.
Yes, that's the problem.
Unfortunate. At an intellectual level, just at the level of an intellectual hygiene, I think that look, also people are bailing. They're bailing out. They're looking for a off ramp, and that's fine. I'm understanding of that. I'm even sympathetic to it. Right. So they want an off ramp from their leftism.
Well, I see it as like, when people ask, am I like a leftist? I say, like in substance, I define the left as, a tendency to prefer equality and change over a hierarchy and conservation, which is conservatism. But these are relational terms.
Right.
And today the left is all about change, but not really about equality. I mean, it's about equality in some senses, but it's like, this term is useless to me. And I feel like because it's this left and right is bound up with like Democrats, Republican, liberal, conservative, it's just going to be inherently an obfuscation. And the question I would ask is, like, I'm sympathetic to the idea of rebuilding the quote unquote real left, a better left. But I don't know, in a time where like it's predominantly left is a predominantly, managerial class and student phenomenon, and where so much of working class people associate it with like bohemian upper middle class urbanite progressivism. It's like, is the left right binary like just at this point something that's a band-aid worth, or not a band-aid, just like
it's counterproductive.
Tumor, maybe a tumor worth.
It might even be. That's right. Well, it certainly is a distortion, and it is a drain, potentially. I mean, again, I feel like the working class probably doesn't care so much. I mean, the problem with the class stuff is that working class people, when they become politicized, become crazy leftists or crazy rightists ideologically anyway, because it's what's available. Meaning they can get politicized and turned into cranks as much as any managerial types, right? So that's the other thing, is that I'm also aware of the fact that the class question has almost nothing to do with the ideas question. So it's not like some ideas lend themselves to certain class perspectives and others don't.
That's certainly not true, given that what the left's made up of today.
Right. And so
I mean, I'm like super aware of this because I've been in PMC circles my whole adult life, but I went to public school and with pretty much socializing like around working class people the whole time. And some of my closest friends didn't even go to college.
Right, of course.
And like the common reaction I would get sometimes when I would talk about lefty stuff, like they would hear I was a leftist and they'd be very skeptical.
But
when I'd talk to them, they'd be like, well, you're not like one of those, like,
right.
You're not like one of those,
right.
One of those pinkos or one of those, whatever, there's like, however one wants to understand it. But like, I think they associate left as something like, we want to lecture you on why all your heteronormative oppressive attitudes are wrong.
Nowadays, that's all that it's. Absolutely.
I mean, it's been that way for quite a bit.
It's been that way for a good while now, like 10 years. Yeah, it's been that way for a little bit now. So I met with, when I went to New York recently, about a month and a half ago, I met with the Compact editors, the editors of my crazy writings this year. And so one of them characterized me as trying to save Marxism from the left. And I thought, oh, that's a fair, appraisal. Now, he is more conservative. So, what he meant by that was, if Marxism is what you say it is, Chris, I kind of like it. If it's what the left says it is, then I hate it.
Yeah, that was literally the reaction I would get. And these same people would usually like Bernie. And
right.
And sometimes they would, if not liking Trump, they would be kind of like, he's all right. He's like
open.
Yeah.
Open. No, there certainly was a lot of that. In 2016, I was just going to say, in 2016, my, early campaign for a socialist party, like we tried to meet people at like Bernie watch parties, like Bernie debate watch parties during the primaries. And we met all sorts of people, interesting people. And there were a lot of people, and they were mostly, like here in Chicago, they were mostly people of color who were like, if not Bernie, then Trump. Blacks and Latinos were almost totally, like the people who showed up at those Bernie events were like, if not Bernie, then Trump.
The Bernie bros, by which they really mean working class people who didn't go to
Yeah,
college.
because this is women too, right? It wasn't just men; it was women.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
so, women, it was veterans. Some of them were veterans, military veterans, and women veterans, as well as men veterans of the war on terror. I would say especially them, because they saw Bernie and Trump as the anti-war candidates and Hillary as the pro-war candidate. And so, but they were like working class. And so there was a funny kind of class division there, that here in Chicago, at least, because I think that there were white upper and middle class people who were pro Bernie, but I think the middle class people of color were pro Hillary. For sure.
That's the thing.
Yeah. So
I mean, yeah, that was like the Breakfast Club, very popular hip hop media. And
total.
I remember when Charlemagne the God endorsed Hillary over Bernie, and then Kamala over Biden over Bernie. And a lot of people were surprised by that. But I mean, it's like
Not at all.
we'd have been saying there's a black bourgeoisie too. Why do we think that there isn't?
Yeah, well, you're not supposed to say so, especially as a white person.
Well, I can claim a little indigenous heritage because I have Native American ancestry, so I can be like Elizabeth Warren, and
right,
my immunity.
Right.
I've never done that though. That's crazy.
No, it's tricky. Right, it's tricky claiming one's heritage, or maybe even not so deep heritage. So yeah, I mean, I think that this is where I wanted to get people thinking, and I wanted to make an appeal to, as I put it, the would-be socialist intelligentsia. And say, okay, throw down the gauntlet. Say, are you really socialists? In some ways, it was coming full circle in my writing for Sublation. The first thing I wrote for Sublation was Dogmatization and Thought Taboos. And that's a talk that I gave on a panel with Norman Finkelstein and some other people in New York and Brooklyn, where I just said, look, I'd love to say you all in the audience here are proletarian socialists. You're petty bourgeois radicals. And, and so your socialism, your Marxism just ain't the case, and it got Norman Finkelstein upset. He's like, you sound like my old Maoist comrades denouncing the petty bourgeoisie. And I was like, yeah, I'm not denouncing. I'm just saying, let's get real for a second. And I wasn't exempting myself either. I started out with you and I ended up with we in that article. And meaning like, what are we leftists? And, just trying to snap them out of it. And here it's kind of like, would you want to be something else? Would you want to be something else? And what would it mean to become a socialist in original sense of proletarian socialism? And do you want to be useful to a working class movement for socialism, or do you just want to have ideological debates forever? And, have your niche connoisseurship of like intellectual stuff, of pseudo-intellectual stuff. You want to be like puzzling over Badiou and Rancière and whomever else is there for the rest of your life, or do you want to be useful, to a working class movement for socialism? If so, then, I'm here to suggest another way, which is guided by my understanding of Marxism, but is not reducible to that, because I actually am quite, I don't know. We'd have to prove the validity of Marxism. I don't start with the assumption that Marxism is correct. I don't. Right? I think that there are real open questions there. And, it could be that...
I like what you're thinking.
Right. That's right. So that's really the purpose of that article. And hopefully it will spur some discussion. I'm very glad that you put me on to discuss it. This is what I was looking for. And yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple things I wanted to mention, but we can discuss in the back briefly.
Huh? Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was a couple of things. Well, okay, so one is like if we have workers on both sides of the aisle, who have, as you put it, an example, who might disagree on abortion, for example.
Right.
I mean, there's some people, there's just no changing their mind on that. So you're gonna have to deal with the fact that there is gonna be like some people who don't agree on that. What does that mean to get workers on both sides of the aisle? Because I think there's one group that is causing a lot of disruption in left discourse because they've responded to this contradiction, but I think in the wrong way.
Yes.
Which is the MAGA communists, which is to actually tail those views and basically just take on every reactionary position to appeal to working class people by being like very like anti-trans. Whereas I think it's different to be trans skeptical or to be agnostic versus just like doubling down on like, oh, trans is bourgeois decadence. Like they kind of.
I think it's a funny thing that Haas said once. He said, we're not homophobic, we're not transphobic because we don't blame the victims of capitalism. And, look, I'm gay. Is my homosexuality a phenomenon of capitalism? For sure. Definitely. Is it a phenomenon of bourgeois decadence? For sure. And that's not a good thing. Right? So it's like, maybe that's all I need from someone like Haas to say I'm not going to blame the victims of capitalism. Meaning, I'm not going to support the lifestyle, but I'm also not going to be an active homophobe either. I mean, with abortion
policies,
right? The policies.
The thing is like they really like Russia.
Oh no, I know
and stuff like that, which is like the hyper conservative Iran.
But again, it's like
the being a phenomenon of capitalism. I mean, that's like Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century, like when he was observing market societies, he thought that market societies in cities particularly had a feminizing effect. This is like the old the metrosexual theory, right? Like, it's of course largely true. I mean, like where are the most progressive places? The richest countries, but it's like, so what? Do you want to like just like ban stuff? And I don't. For me, I defend most like rights on the basis of bourgeois rights because that's what I see it as arena of bourgeois politics, and I think it's consistently
right to privacy, right to individual autonomy. Government out of the bedroom, this kind of thing. So on abortion, I mean, the way I put it, because I wondered about including in the article. I did because I thought, okay, here's something to talk about. I said the working class will do what's necessary to survive, meaning people who are morally opposed to abortion and who therefore are suckers for capitalist political demagogy. Meaning the demagogy of thinking that the law enshrines morality, because obviously it doesn't. Mm-hmm. Who are susceptible to that. Who see the law as like an official proclamation of moral principle. Whereas in fact, no, that's not the purpose of the law. But anyway, let's leave people.
Unless you're a theocrat, but
unless you're but then of course people are not. So the people who are morally opposed to abortion will still get an abortion. That's it. That's reality, right? So we start there, like, and so, do you know what I mean? Like, it's actually pretty easy to navigate this. Like in other words, you just don't like. That's just not the thing, right? And then you at a more practical level, you educate people about the difference between law and morality, especially in capitalism. Like there is a kind of bourgeois distinction between law and morality that's more enlightened. But in capitalism, the distinction between law and morality, I think that people can understand that the law often serves injustice in capitalism, even against people who are doing things that you might morally disapprove of, that they might be unjustly penalized by the law. I think that these are the connections that can be drawn, right? Where it's not like, okay, we're starting a socialist party in order to make sure that abortion is legal. No, because we don't have any power over that, right? It's like it came down to a Supreme Court decision. How much power does anyone have over that, right? So, unless you just want to do like spectacle or threaten judges, like nasty tweets or something, like, it's like, okay, what are we talking about here? And again, there is a kind of progressive liberal messaging about like, you want, abortion to be safe, and therefore you need it to be legal because people are going to get abortions anyway. And so do you really want people to be suffering needlessly, back alley abortions? That's fine. That's just a different way. That's just a way of thinking about policy. Again, from a working class perspective, it's more like, where abortion is illegal, what are people going to do? Right? And that's where it's just a different question and an abstractly moral question. And that was really where I was going with that. Which is that, look, capitalist politics is not about abstract moral questions either, but it will pretend to be. It will demagogue it. And we just don't want to be part of that. I think that everybody can agree on that. Right? So what we're really talking about is like socialists who are anti-abortion and socialists who are pro-abortion.
Right. In the back room, I wanted to discuss with you a few things. One is the, implications of being able to potentially get working class people on board for a socialist agenda and have a socialist party mobilize working class people without alienating people based on, arbitrary political disagreements, which may be contradictions, but not irreconcilable contradictions, or like they're not primary contradictions. And without, doing the kind of red baiting, as they call it, I think, or not red baiting, but like the idea of being like, look, right? It's this very idea of like, I think, an understanding of that it assumes working class people are a lot stupider.
Oh, no, I know.
Like this idea that,
yeah,
I hate trans people too. Come vote for me. And
Oh,
it's like,
damn.
why would they? It's like, I don't know. But the thing is the wokes really don't even like it if you propose the idea of being agnostic on some of these issues.
No.
So it's like, how does one, navigate these waters? And big question is, your whole thing is, the left is dead. Long live the left.
Yes.
When did the left die? That's the question we're going to tackle in the back room.
Great.
If you're not a patron already, it's how this show stays afloat. YouTube videos don't make much money. It's actually the patrons that carry this thing and make it possible. And you get access to, at this point, well over 70 exclusive episodes. Some of the most interesting conversations I've had have been in the back room only. So check that out. And if you're not a supporter already, what you doing? See you there.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.